Part 2, Chapter 1 of Family Happiness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Family Happiness by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. Part 2, Chapter 1. Days, weeks, 2 months of lonely country life went by, imperceptibly as it seemed at that time. But, at the same time, the emotions, sensations, and delights of those 2 months would have sufficed for a whole lifetime. Both my dreams and his, of how our life in the country should be organized, were not realized at all as we had anticipated. But our life was in no respect a disappointment of our dreams. It was not that strenuous labor, the fulfillment of duty, self-renunciation, and life for others that I had imagined when I became his betrothed. It was, on the contrary, an absorbing, selfish affection for one another, a desire to be loved, a constant, causeless delight, and oblivion of all in the world. To be sure, he sometimes went into his study, shut himself up to attend to his affairs. Sometimes he went to town, and, again, he was absent on business about the estate. But I saw how hard it was for him to tear himself away from me. And he himself acknowledged that everything in the world seemed to him such perfect triviality, unless I were there, that he could not conceive the possibility of taking any interest in them. It was exactly the same with me. I read, occupied myself with my music, with his mother, with the school, but I did this only because each one of these occupations was connected with him and met with his approbation. But as soon as ever the thought of him failed to be connected with any particular task, my hands would fall at my side, and it would seem so odd to think that there was anyone beside him in the world. Possibly this was an unworthy, selfish thought, but it gave me pleasure and elevated me high above all the world. In my eyes he was the only being on earth, and I considered him the handsomest and most perfect man in the world. Consequently, I could not live for anyone beside him, or help trying to be in his eyes what he thought me to be. And he considered me the first and the most beautiful woman in the world, endowed with every possible perfection, and I strove to be this woman in the eyes of the first and best man in all the world. Once he came into my chamber while I was engaged in prayer. I glanced at him and continued with my devotions. He sat down at the table so as to not disturb me and opened a book. But it seemed to me that he was looking at me, and I looked round. He smiled. I began to laugh and could not go on with my devotions. "And have you already said your prayers?" I asked. "Yes, but go on, I will leave you. You say your prayers, I hope, don't you?" He made no reply and was about to go, but I detained him. "My sweetheart, please, for my sake, read a prayer with me." He stood by my side, awkwardly dropping his hands, and began with a serious countenance, but falteringly, to read. Now and then he turned to me as if to find approbation and encouragement in my face. When he had read it through, I laughed and gave him a hug. "That's the way with thee. It's just as though I were 10 years old again," he exclaimed, reddening and kissing my hand. Our house was one of those old country mansions in which lived, in mutual love and reverence, several generations of one family. It was all redolent of sweet, pure family recollections, and these, when I came to live in it, seemed suddenly to have become part and parcel with my own traditions. The furnishing and adornment of the house were in the old-fashioned style, such as Tatiana Semyonovna preferred. It could not be said that they were elegant and magnificent, but there was an abundance of everything, from servants to furniture and food. Everything was tidy, solid, stiff, and awe-inspiring. In the reception room the furniture was arranged with symmetrical precision. The wall was hung with portraits, homemade rugs and striped linen were spread on the floor. In the drawing-room stood an old grand piano, chiffoniers of 2 distinct styles, sofas, and brass and mother-of-pearl tables. My boudoir, by the care of Tatiana Semyonovna, was furnished with the most beautiful furniture of different centuries and styles, and, among other things, an old pier-glass, into which I could never glance without a sense of bashfulness, but which finally became as dear to me as an old friend. Tatiana Semyonovna did not let her voice be heard in the house, but everything went like clockwork, though there were a great many superfluous servants. All of these servants, who wore soft shoes without heels, Tatiana Semyonovna considered squeaking shoes and the noise of heels as the most unpleasant things in the world. All of the servants seemed proud of their station, and trembled before the old lady, looked upon my husband and me with patronizing affection, and evidently did their work with extraordinary contentment. Regularly every Saturday, all the floors in the house were washed and the rugs beaten. On the first day of the month a Te Deum was performed and holy water sprinkled. Every time that a name's day occurred, Tatiana Semyonovna's, her son's, or mine occurred for the first time that autumn, a banquet was given to all the neighbourhood, and all this sort of thing had been done without ever a break in the custom since Tatiana Semyonovna's earliest remembrance. My husband did not interfere in the domestic economy, and merely took charge of the management of the farm and the serfs, and that occupied him a good deal. Even in winter he got up very early, and was usually gone when I woke. He returned generally to morning tea, which we drank by ourselves, and almost always at this time, after the troubles and annoyances of his work, he would appear in that extraordinarily jolly frame of mind which we used to call wild enthusiasm. Oftentimes I tried to induce him to tell me what he did in the morning, and he would relate such absurdities that we almost died laughing. Sometimes I urged him to give me a serious account, and he would restrain himself and tell me. I looked into his eyes at the motion of his lips, and remembered nothing, but I was merely delighted to see him and to hear his voice. "Well, what have I been telling you? Let us hear it," he would say, and I could not tell him the first word. It was so absurd that he should tell me about anything else than our own selves. It scarcely made any difference what it was that he had been doing. It was not until long afterward that I began to understand or feel any interest in his labours. Tatiana Semyonovna did not make her appearance till dinner time. She drank her tea alone and only sent a messenger to inquire how we had slept. In our especial, insanely happy little world, it sounded so strange to hear the voice from her solemn, orderly quarters, so different from ours, that oftentimes I could not refrain from laughing heartily in reply to the maid who, with folded arms, gravely announced that Tatiana Semyonovna has sent to inquire how you feel after your yesterday's ride, and she begs to inform you in regard to herself that she suffered all night long from the neuralgia, and that a stupid dog in the village barked and prevented her from getting any rest, and she also would be pleased to know how you liked today's baking, and begs to remark that Taras did not bake the bread today, but that Nikolashka was allowed to try his hand for the first time as an experiment, and has not done at all badly, says she, especially in the rolls, but he cooked the pies too much. Till dinner time we were very little together. I played, read to myself, he wrote or went out again, but at 4 o'clock, when we had dinner, we went to the drawing-room. Mamasha sailed out of her room, and several visitors, indigent ladies of noble birth, several of whom we always had at the house, made their appearance. Regularly, each day, my husband, in accordance with immemorial custom, offered his mother his arm to take her out to dinner, but she insisted that he should give me his other, and regularly each day we got into a tangle at the door, which was too narrow for all of us. Mother presided at dinner, and the conversation proceeded with dignified sobriety and not a little solemnity. The few simple words that my husband and I exchanged made an agreeable contrast to the stiffness of these dinner-table conferences. Occasionally disputes arose between mother and son, and they said sarcastic things to one another. I especially enjoyed these disputes and sarcasms, because they served to bring out in all the stronger light the firm and tender love that united them. After dinner, Maman went into the reception-room and sat down in her great armchair, rubbed tobacco or cut open the leaves of newly purchased books, while my husband and I would read aloud or go into the drawing-room to the piano. We read a great deal during these weeks, but music was our favourite and supreme enjoyment, for each time it touched new chords in our hearts, and, as it were, discovered each of us to the other again. When I played his favourite pieces, he would sit on the sofa at the other end of the room where I could hardly see him, and from very shyness would try to conceal the impression which the music made upon him. But often, when he did not expect it, I would jump up from the piano, run over to him, and try to detect on his face the traces of the emotion, an unnatural light and moisture in his eyes, which he tried in vain to hide from me. Mamasha often wanted to visit us in the drawing-room, but she was afraid of interrupting us, and sometimes, apparently not looking at us, she would pass through the room with a pretended grave and indifferent face. But I knew that she had no reason to go to her room, and so would quickly return. In the evening I poured tea in the great reception-room, and once more all the people of the house gathered at the table. This solemn seat of ceremony before the polished samovar, and the distribution of the glasses and cups, for a long time filled me with trepidation. It seemed to me that I was not yet fitted for this responsibility, that I was too young and giddy to turn the faucet of the big samovar, and to put the glass on the butler's salver and say, "For Pyotr Ivanovitch, for Marya Minichna," and ask her if it is weak enough, and to put in the lumps of sugar for the nurse and the servants. "Splendid, splendid," my husband used often to say, "just like a grown-up lady," and this confused me more than ever. After tea, Maman played solitaire or heard Marya Minichna tell fortunes. Then she would kiss us and make the sign of the cross over us, and we would retire to our own rooms. Generally, however, we would sit up till midnight, and this was the best and pleasantest part of the day. He would tell me about his past, we would make plans. Sometimes we would discuss philosophy and do our best to talk low so as not to be heard upstairs, and that no suspicion of it might reach Tatyana Semyonovna, who believed in early retiring. Sometimes we would get hungry and go softly down to the sideboard, find some cold supper provided by Nikita's thoughtfulness, and eat it in my boudoir by the light of a single candle. We lived quite like visitors in this splendid old mansion, over which brooded the stern spirit of old personified in Tatyana Semyonovna. Not only she, but the servants, the old serving maids, the furniture, and the paintings inspired in me a certain respect, a certain awe, and a consciousness that we were not exactly fitted for such associations, and that it was our duty to live a circumspect and careful sort of existence here. As I look back upon it now, it seems that much must have been really stiff and uncomfortable. That stern, unchangeable order and that throng of lazy, inquisitive people in the house. But then, at that time, that very restraint gave an additional strength to our love. Neither he nor I gave the slightest sign that anything displeased us. On the contrary, he would have resolutely shut his eyes to the fact that it was disagreeable. Mamanka's valet, Dmitri Sidorov, a great lover of smoking, while we were in the drawing-room, each day after dinner, went regularly to my husband's study and took tobacco from his drawer, and it was worth while to see what merry dismay Sergyei Mikhailitch came to me on his tiptoes, and, making a warning gesture with his finger and winking, pointed to Dmitri Sidorov, who never suspected that he was suspected. And, when Dmitri Sidorov went out without noticing us, in his joy that all had ended so satisfactorily, as in everything else, my husband said that I was charming and kissed me. Sometimes this easy-going way, this forgiving disposition, and, as it were, apparent indifference, were not pleasing to me. I did not realize that I was open to the same fault, and I called it weakness. Just like a child that does not dare show his will, I said to myself. "Ah, my dear," he replied one time, when I told him how much surprised I was at his weakness, "would it be possible for me to be angry with anyone when I am so happy? It is easier for me to let things go than to try to force others. I was convinced of that long ago, and there is no state where it is impossible to be happy. And we are having such a good time. I cannot be angry. For me now there is no such thing as bad, it is only pitiful and rather amusing. But the main thing is, le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. Would you believe me when I hear the doorbell or read a letter, or simply when I wake up? I have a feeling of terror. Terror because I must live, lest some change may take place, for nothing could be better than what is now." I believed him, but I did not understand him. It was delightful to me, but it seemed to me that it was just as it ought to be, that it could not be otherwise, that it was always so, with all people, and that elsewhere there were other forms of happiness, different perhaps, but not greater. Thus passed the 2 months. Winter came with its cold weather and snowstorms, and, though he was still with me, I began to feel the loneliness, began to feel that life was monotonous, and that it offered neither of us anything new, and that we seemed to be returning forever in our old tracks. He began to busy himself more than before with his own affairs, to the neglect of myself, and again my former idea came back to me, that he had in his soul an especial world from which I was debarred. His perpetual self-complacency irritated me. I loved him no less than before. I was no less happy in his love. But my love had come to a standstill and ceased to grow, and now beside love a new feeling of restlessness began to take possession of my soul. The continuance of love was very insignificant after the first experience of finding that I loved him. What I longed for was activity and not the calmness of a settled life, emotions, perils, and self-renunciations instead of thought. I had within me an exuberance of strength which found no field of activity in our quiet life. I was attacked by storms of melancholy which I tried to hide from his knowledge, as something naughty, and fits of unnatural tenderness and gaiety that frightened him. He noticed my state of mind even before I did, and proposed that we should go to town, but I begged him not to go, and not to change our way of living, not to destroy our happiness. And indeed I was happy, but it tormented me that this happiness caused me no exertion, no sacrifice, when I was tormented by all the potentiality of labour and self-sacrifice. I loved him, and I saw that I was everything to him. But I wanted all to see our love. I wanted something to come as a stumbling block in the way of my loving, and still I should have loved him. My mind and my feelings even were occupied, but there was still above and beyond all that another feeling, that of youth, the necessity for exertion, and these found no scope in our quiet life. Why did he tell me that we might go to town, when that was the only thing that I wanted? If he had not told me so, perhaps I should have understood that the feeling that tormented me was unwholesome nonsense, and my fault, but the very sacrifice which I was searching for was there before me, in the stifling of this feeling. The thought that I had the power of saving myself from melancholy by merely going to town constantly recurred to me in spite of myself, and at the same time it seemed mean and detestable, simply for my own pleasure to tear him away from all that he loved. But time passed on, the snow piled up higher and higher above the walls of the house, and we were always and forever alone, and still we were always the same in each other's eyes. But yonder, somewhere in the brilliancy, in the whirl of life, were throngs of men and women suffering and rejoicing without a thought of us or our petty existence. Worse than all was my consciousness that each day the habits of our life were forging it into one definite form, that our sensations were growing dull and corresponded to the smooth, passionless course of time. In the morning we were cheerful, at dinner deferential, in the evening affectionate. To do good, said I to myself. It is excellent to do good and live honourable lives, as he says. We still have time for that, but there is something for which now and only now I have the requisite power. This was not what I wanted. I needed a struggle. What I needed was that feeling should guide life, and not that life should guide feeling. I wanted to go with him to the edge of an abyss and say, here a step, and I will throw myself over. Here a motion, and I have gone to destruction. And for him, turning pale, to seize me in his strong arms, hold me back over it till my heart grew cold within me, and then carry me away wherever he pleased. This state of affairs had a bad effect upon my health, and I began to suffer in my nerves. One morning it was worse than usual. He came back from the office out of spirits, which was a rare event for him. I immediately noticed it and asked him what the matter was, but he was not inclined to tell me, saying that it was not worth while and there was no need of it. I afterwards learned that the police Ispravnik had called upon our peasantry, and, out of an unfriendly disposition to my husband, had made illegal claims on them and threatened them. My husband could not as yet look with any degree of coolness on all this, a merely wretched and impertinent piece of business. He was angry, and therefore did not wish to talk with me about it. But it seemed to me that he did not want to tell me about it because he considered me still a child who could not understand what interested him. I turned from him and said nothing, and sent to invite Marya, a visitor of ours, to tea. After tea, which I brought to a most remarkably hasty conclusion, I took Marya into the drawing-room, and began to talk in very loud tone about some trifle or other, of absolutely no interest to me. He came into the room and from time to time looked at us. These glances of his had such a peculiar effect on me that I had all the time stronger and stronger inclination to talk and even to be merry. Everything that I said, as well as everything that Marya said, seemed to me laughable. Without making any remark, he went off to his study and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was out of hearing, all my gaiety suddenly vanished, so that Marya was struck by it and asked me what was the matter. Without answering her, I sat down on the sofa and felt a strong inclination to cry. And what does he think of this performance? I asked myself. Some trifle which seems important to him, but just let him try to tell me. I will show him that it's nonsense. No, he must think that I have no sense. He must needs humiliate me with his majestic calmness, and always be so superior to me. But I'm as right as he is, though it is so stupid and dull here, though I have such a desire to live and stir about, I said to myself, and not to always stay in one place and feel how time is passing. I want to advance, and every day, every hour I want something new, but he wants to stand stock still and hold me back too. And how easy it would be for him. For this it is not necessary to take me to town. It needs only for him to be like me, not to make a display, not to put checks on oneself, but simply to live. This is the very advice that he gave me, but he himself does not follow it. That's what the trouble is. I felt that my heart was filling with tears and that I was angry with him. This exhibition of temper alarmed me, and I went to him. He was sitting in his study writing. When he heard my steps, he glanced up for a moment, calmly and indifferently, and went on with his writing. This look of his displeased me. Instead of going to him, I stood by the table at which he was writing, and, opening a book, I began to turn the leaves of it. Once more he stopped and looked at me. "Masha," said he, "you are out of sorts." I answered with a chilling glance, which said, "What makes you ask? Mere curiosity?" He shook his head with a sweet, affectionate smile, but for the first time I did not give him an answering smile. "What has been the trouble with you today?" I asked. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" "A mere trifle, a slight unpleasantness," he replied. "However, I can tell you now. 2 peasants have been summoned to town." But I did not give him a chance to finish his story. "Why didn't you tell me this when I asked you at tea?" I should have made some foolish remark, for I was angry then. "But then was the time that I wanted to know." "Why?" "Because you think that I can never be of any help to you." "What is that?" he exclaimed, throwing down his pen. I think that I cannot live without you. You not only help me in everything, but you do everything." "How did you get such an idea?" he cried, laughing. "I live only for you. Everything seems good to me. I am happy simply because you are here, because you need—" "Yes, I know that I am a dear child who needs to be calmed," said I, in such a tone that he was amazed, and apparently for the first time noticing what a state of mind I was in, gazed at me. "I don't want calmness. You have enough, quite enough for us both," I added. "Well, now you see what the trouble was," he began hurriedly, interrupting me, apparently fearing to let me say all that I had in mind. "How should you decide the question?" "I don't want to now," I replied. Though I had a strong desire to hear him, I still took a keen delight in disturbing his equanimity. "I don't want to play at life, I want to live," said I, "just as you do." Over his face, which always answered so readily and quickly to every emotion, passed an expression of pain and earnest attention. "I want to live in the same way as you do, on an equality with you." But words failed me. Such grief, such deep grief was expressed in his face. He was silent for a little. "Yes, but you do live on an equality with me, don't you?" he asked, "except that I and not you have to deal with the police, ispravniks and peasants." "No, not in this thing alone," I said. "For heaven's sake, understand me, my love," he went on to say. "I know that it is always painful for us to have anxieties. I have had experience of life, and I knew this. I love you, and I really cannot help wishing to save you from anxiety. My life consists in this, in love for thee, and so don't disturb my life." "You are always right," I cried, not looking at him. I felt annoyed that his soul had again become clear and calm when mine was still filled with vexation and a feeling like repentance. "Masha, what is the matter with you?" he exclaimed. "The question is not whether I am right or you are right, but something quite different. What have you to complain of against me? Don't speak rashly, think it all over and tell me all that you have in your mind. You are angry with me, and of course you must have good reason, but do let me understand wherein I am to blame." But how could I tell him what was in my soul? The very fact that he understood me so immediately, that I was again like a child before him, that I could not do anything without his understanding all about it and even foreseeing it, all this made me still more indignant. "I have nothing at all to complain of against you," said I. "Simply everything seems tedious to me, and I do not wish it to be so. But you say it must be so, and there again you are right." I said this and did not look at him. I attained my purpose. His calmness disappeared, pain and apprehension were in his face. "Masha," he exclaimed in a low, agitated voice, "this is no trifling matter, what you are doing now to me. Now our fate is being decided. I beg of you not to reply to me, but to listen. Why do you want to torture me?" But I interrupted him. "I know that you are right. You had better not speak. You are right," said I, coldly, as though it were not myself but an evil spirit that spoke in me. "If you knew what you were doing," said he in a trembling voice. I burst into tears, and it gave me relief. He sat near me and said nothing. I was sorry for him and ashamed of myself, and vexed at what I had done. I did not look at him. I had an impression that he must be looking at me, either sternly or in perplexity, at that moment. I looked up. His sweet, affectionate glance was fixed upon me, as though asking my forgiveness. I seized his hand and said, "Forgive me, I myself did not know what I was saying." "Yes, but I know what you said, and that what you said was the truth." "What?" I asked. "We must go to Petersburg," said he. "There is nothing for us to do here." "Just as you please," I replied. He took me in his arms and kissed me. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I was to blame toward you." That evening I played a long time to him, and as he walked up and down the room he kept repeating something. He had the habit of whispering, and I often asked him what he was saying, and he always, after a little thought, told me pretty nearly what he was repeating, generally poetry and sometimes terrible rubbish, but I was enabled to tell by it how he felt in his mind. "What are you repeating to yourself?" I asked. He stopped walking, and after a little thought he smiled and repeated 2 lines by Lermontov. "But he insensate begged for tempests, as though in tempests peace were found." "No, he is more than a man, he knows everything," said I to myself. "How is it possible not to love him?" I jumped up, took his arm, and began to walk with him, trying to keep step. "Well?" he asked with a smile, looking at me. "Well," I replied in a whisper, and a strangely merry frame of mind took possession of both of us, and, taking longer and longer steps, and standing higher and higher on our tiptoes, and with the same step, to the great indignation of Grigory, and to the amazement of Mamasha, who was playing patience in the reception room, we rushed through all the rooms into the dining room, and there we stopped looking at each other and burst into hearty laughter. At the end of a fortnight, just before Christmas, we were in Petersburg. End of Part 2, Chapter 1.